Intelligence as a stat has one fundamental problem. Despite it being the wizard casting stat, it is fundamentally basic. This is evident within the polls where it remains mid in terms of the perception of power and yet still low in favorability. In fact, it is surprising to see how little attention this stat has on the radar on any of the polls. Arcane may have been seen with levels of disgust and bad design, Dex and Faith with a lot of love yet very low satisfaction, and Strength appearing perfect by every metric. So why is Int so ignored? And I believe that is because of how basic the stat is in terms of damage diversity and spells. Because of its limitations, it does not reach the same height as Faith in personal enjoyment or in diversity. And for me, it is a shame, especially for what is sold to us as the wizard stat. This is not because of the lack of power. In fact, intelligence is by far one of the strongest stats both in PvP and in PvE. Rather, I believe it is because of how restricted and basic the stat feels, especially when you look at both the spell and build variety. I know plenty of people are going to disagree, but please hear me out. So let's look at the core issues, and I believe we could break it down in a couple ways. We can start this off with a lot of the spells being too similar to the previous ones. The low damage diversity in terms of both physical and elemental. Not only that, it does not benefit too much from other stats, and some of the sorcerer designs are quite horrible. And yes, a lot of these spells are also very similar to previous games. And let's talk about how the similarity to previous games is actually kind of an issue. And I'm going to use Dark Souls 3 as a benchmark, as it is by far the game that's most similar to Elden Ring from the previous titles. And it is the one that players are most familiar with. Specifically, intelligence has not changed too much from Dark Souls 3 compared to Faith. Intelligence has, yes, gained some incredible weapons, such as Moonveil, the Wings of Estelle, which is a breath of fresh air, and yes, adding Frost to the Darkmoon Greatsword, a classic weapon, does add a new level of power to it. But let's look at what Int actually got changed from Dark Souls 3, both what they gained and what they lost. And a huge thing they lost is Pyromancies, which was relegated to Faith. And a lot of the other spells they have are very similar to what they were within Dark Souls. Things from Soul Arrow, Soul Dart, Soul Spear, Dark Sorceries, and Soul Stream are incredibly similar to what we see in Elden Ring. In fact, there's very few sorceries that feel fresh compared to previous games. While you might get something fresh such as Eternal Darkness, Briar Sorceries, Gall of Haima, Great Ocular Bubble, the Full Moon and Dark Moon sorceries, as well as the Meteorite and Gravity sorceries. Some of these sorceries do seem very similar to previous Pyromancies, but they do magic damage. The problem is, these do not come close to the diversity you get within the new incantations. Look at what we got with incantations for a second. The Dragon Communion, the Bestial, the Frenzied Flame, the Dragon Cult, Blood Flame, Servants of Rot, Black Flame, and Placidus Axe's Ruin are all something new and fresh. And I don't really get that within the intelligence builds. Not only that, a lot of the sorceries you do get that are unique and new, such as the Briar sorceries and the Claimant sorceries, are very much restricted because they require another stat in order to access it. Which you might believe it would help out with synergy, but I'm going to cover that later. Let's get back to the topic of Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 3, you had 34 sorceries and 30 pyromancies. Not including miracles, you have about 64 accessible spells. In Elden Ring, there is a total of 70 sorceries, some of which do not have any int requirement or is not intended to be used with int at all. In fact, when you play through Elden Ring and you were to get these sorceries, a lot of them are very similar. A very similar pattern emerges too. These are almost one-to-one with a lot of the sorceries from Dark Souls 3, and that is not a bad thing. Dark Souls 3 had a fantastic sorcery system, but the lack of being given anything new is kind of a problem. And you might look at it and be like, well, you got 6 more spells, and of course there were some spells that, or sorceries that scaled mostly off of Faith within Dark Souls 3, but the problem is the diversity of magic was not expanded, rather shifted, and especially when Faith had lost the majority of its repeat spells, sorceries did not. In fact, sorceries kept some and then added more, only just to have it be a different flavor of a very similar spell. And while that works with a lot of the great sword sorceries, it doesn't work with a lot of the glintstone and comet sorceries. And that is because a lot of the sorceries that repeated, yes, were progression based, but a lot of them were also just different flavors, a different damage type, if you will. Yes, the lack of diversity does matter, and damage type, and this becomes apparent when pyromancies are removed, but not only that, dark was also removed from intelligence builds. And while yes, you do have the meteorite sorceries, only one does pure physical damage, while the other two do split damage, and the rest that aren't really a meteorite but rather like gravity well have just straight magic damage, meaning that you're relegated to magic damage. Like the faith into option within sorceries is actually just mostly still magic damage. I am not criticizing it at all in terms of the lack of damage. Trust me, the damage on all of this stuff is totally fine. It is probably the strongest build within the game. But with all that was removed, including the dark damage type, the fire damage, and everything else, it just has a level of like, it makes intelligence itself feel less interesting than what it was in Dark Souls 3, while other stats all got a massive boost in diversity. And this could be mended with better and more interesting magma or gravity sorceries. I would recommend only one because you don't want another faith stat, especially since there's quite a few things that int does better than faith. Going into the magma sorceries again, yes, it is another interesting way to do damage. The big problem, as I mentioned, is that it requires faith, but not only that, it is very, very janky to use. Now, these magma sorceries could do a lot of damage, and they are best in PvE applications, but they leave a lot to be desired. Everything from the damage to EP ratio is unforgiving. Let's go and look back at the Briar sorceries I mentioned earlier, specifically Briars of Punishment and Briars of Sin. So outside of Aldrich, who did you see use any aberrant sorceries? And while I love the theme of these sorceries, they look awesome, but they don't play well. And that is why you really can't even use the Albanarch staff to use with it, which genuinely just hurts the synergy with intelligence going to any other stat, even if this does have a decent faith requirement. This is a huge missed opportunity because there really isn't int arcane builds or any other build like that. Yes, you have one good in one meh sorcery that requires arcane, but that is only an int investment. And after that, you're not going to be building arcane on that at all. The Albanarch staff is really just good if you want to use sorceries, but you don't want to invest into intelligence and you want to use a lot of bleed weapons on the side. Especially since it still just does magic damage. Most of what it does is magic damage. Yes, you do have, like I said, some physical and some fire damage, but the physical and fire damage opportunities isn't that good. Alright, going back to the topic of diversity, intelligence doesn't really do a good job synergizing with other stats too well. And no, it is not just arcane. Let's look at strength. Despite gravity weapons, this really treats intelligence as more of a wall to overcome. Yes, the majority of gravity weapons do scale partially on intelligence, both the Ash of War and the magic scaling, but it scales so much better on strength that there's really no point in investing in intelligence. You may as well put those points into faith because those can actually give you just overall buffs to your damage. The only other connection between intelligence and strength is going to be frost weapons, which scale the magic damage according to intelligence and the physical damage from both strength and dexterity. Unlike any other affinity, and this right here is what makes it different, because this scaling allows you to pretty much ignore the int scaling. As in, it is not necessary. Yes, it can be supplementary to certain builds, specifically dex builds. Dex does work fantastic with intelligence. In strength, there are some synergies, yes, but you're usually going to be building one or the other and having the other one as a wall to overcome, because strength really doesn't benefit int builds. There's no strength int staff or any strength int moonveil or anything like that when you have a style. No, it's pretty much like if you're going to go either all in one or all in the other and just use the other one as a minimum, a wall to overcome. The other gravity Ashes of War are just there to be another magic flavored Ash of War, despite the fact that these somber weapons have a conflicting scaling to them. Now let's compare this to dexterity. The stat that just synergizes the best with intelligence, and that is because Dex does boost casting speed, and there's a lot of weapons that scale best if it's split between one and the other. Yes, I did complain a lot about dexterity as a individual stat, a solo stat, and as a primary stat, but as a supplementary stat, it is fantastic for other builds. The Moon Veil and a Carrion Regal Scepter is iconic. And the synergy goes both ways. If you were to be running a int build and you want to build some dex, you could do that. But if you want to run a dex build, you could actually build some int, not to cast sorceries, but to use certain combinations or just to complement the overall build. And before I hear people be like, okay, cool, Frost can help synergize with other builds, that is correct. The issue is Frost is not an exclusive intelligence thing. Yes, Frost does add some intelligence scaling, but intelligence does not scale up the Frost the same way that Arcane does. You are going to want to increase the AR of the weapon, and so here's how Frost works. It's going to increase the physical scaling attributes, reduce the base damage, and add some base magic damage scaling with some intelligence added on. So what you really want to do is you want to be building either strength or magic, especially since increasing your intelligence isn't going to increase the physical damage, unlike the magic affinity, making it hardly even a magic scaling Ash of War to begin with. This works really well with a dex and int build because you could build a Cold and Nagakiba Uchikatana with a Rivers of Blood in the other hand and just synergize that incredibly well, proccing the Frostbite and then resetting it. And this gives you the advantage of having the max speed of the sorceries while still doing high sorcerer damage and using a weapon combo based off of the application of status effects. This right here does not happen with strength builds. The only weapon, or really any other combination that does super well with a pure split mixture is going to be the Royal Greatsword, which is more the exception and not the rule, and even then, strength does not give any other benefit to the intelligence builds. Because you get weapons such as not just the Frost Uchikatana, you also get the Death Poker, one of the best greatswords in the game. Making a 45-45 split or a 50-40 split of some type very much encouraged. Like, Dex and Int is nothing to joke around about. There is a reason why people play it all the time. Now let's go back to damage diversity, because there's one other stat that Int does build somewhat well with, but also kind of not. And let me explain this one, and that is going to be Faith and Int, the two sets which appear to hold up to each other back to back and go hand in hand, but they're very, very different. While Pyromancies and Holy Damage were all consolidated into Faith, Holy Damage is the equivalent of Dark Damage within Dark Souls 3. The synergy isn't gone, it just has one issue, and that is stat investment and how it is handled. Effectively, you are going to invest, and you need to invest a lot more into both stats in order to get the same numbers as investing in just one and going for that dexterity, vigor, int, and mind. Really, the sorcerers and the incants is not what gets this build to work if you want to go this build. Rather, you're going to be using the Sword of Night and Flame, one of my favorite weapons in the game, but still, it doesn't really make up for this difference. Yes, you could technically build the incantations for fire damage and run an intelligence build using the Golden Order Seal, but it's not optimal, and really, at that point, you're just trying to play a Pyromancer. In general, I believe the only thing that really should have been changed is just a much more easier use of Magma Sorceries, or just more physical damage within some Gravity Sorceries, or even just a unique kind of int weapon that has some sort of physical scaling. Probably something that's gravity based, because there's not enough gravity based intelligence somber weapons. Personally, I'm going to go back to Dark Souls 3 for 1 second, because unfortunately the holy damage was the equivalent to dark damage, as I mentioned previously. The issue is you could run that mostly using intelligence in Dark Souls 3 and have that extra level of diversity, but you can't here, and even then, now it has a very, very different use. You don't get those extra levels of depth and that interesting gameplay. You're not really thinking of the meaningful options. You're thinking, what spell is going to do the highest and biggest damage in this situation, not thinking about the opponent you're fighting. This is probably the biggest benefit of playing a strength build, but usually I'm thinking, alright, am I going to have to hit him with a club? Am I going to have to use fire damage? Is slashing going to be the best thing here? Or what am I going to be doing? And this right here happens with other builds too. This happens with dex builds. This happens with arcane builds. Arcane, am I going to need to bleed them? Oh, I can't bleed them? Well, I'm not going to use a bleed weapon. I'm going to use an occult weapon. Maybe an occult mace. And really, I believe that is the biggest thing that hurts intelligence, because intelligence does not need additional power. It just needs a level of diversity that is more insane. Arcane literally has every status effect. It has every single damage type. And the same thing goes to holy damage. Dexterity has grown a lot since Dark Souls 3. And despite the fact that it is relatively weaker since it was kind of ridiculous in Dark Souls 3, it still is a improvement. And strength, I think that strength was handled the best. Like, it does pretty much everything, but in a way that doesn't hurt anything else. Pretty much what I'm getting at here is I think that intelligence just needs more options. Not options are going to make it more powerful. It doesn't need more power. In fact, there's some cases where it could use less power. But the fact that it is kind of only given one damage type and a status effect that is not really exclusive to itself but only somewhat loosely connected kind of makes me feel like it could have been given a bit more. It could have been made more fresh, more unique, something more interesting. What I'm getting at is I just think it could use a level of versatility. I dislike the notion that it should have weird hacks powers and be the magic build should be broken because it feels right, but I do feel like it should be known for something more versatile, and because it's magic. It's supposed to be interesting.